In this video, we'll be discussing Native American and Indigenous philosophies, or what can be called life ways. Indigenous, as we had mentioned previously, merely means native to an area, and the philosophies, or ways of living lives, that we'll discuss here would likely be applicable to all sorts of native and indigenous cultures around the world. Many of them share similar features, which we'll identify today. After we've dealt with indigenous philosophies in quite broad strokes, we'll focus specifically on an indigenous Middle Eastern or Persian religious story about a character named Gilgamesh and his relationship to a polytheistic Babylonian religious system and its philosophy. Let's begin first, though, with Native American and indigenous ways of living life. Oftentimes, these indigenous religions and philosophies have a closer relationship with nature and land, sometimes with female deities. And this is true around the world. They often include the idea of ancestor worship, reincarnation, and a cyclical conception of time. Ancestor worship is seen in many different religions, most notably in Confucianism, which we'll be discussing later. But it has a similarity with Western Catholicism, in the sense that in Catholicism, a person can pray to a recently deceased or passed on loved one. A devout father, mother, grandmother, or aunt can be prayed to for what's called intercession, which literally means help from the spirit world. Furthermore, Catholicism has the honored and holy dead, people like saints, even Mary, Mother of Jesus, who can be prayed to speak to God and the Godhead on one's behalf. While this isn't technically ancestor worship, it does have similarities with it. Reincarnation, or the idea that after death one is reborn into a new body, is seen in Hinduism as well as Buddhism, both of which we'll discuss later. And one of the interesting implications of reincarnation is that instead of escaping the earth, never to return, or only to return after it has been perfected, one winds up again and again and again in the same place, in the same environment. I like to use the example of a person who might be reincarnated in Japan, near where the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster occurred. If a person were to die and be reincarnated, they might reincarnate as a butterfly and be subject to the same radiation. They might then die and become a fish, and again be subject to the same radiation. After being a fish, they might die and become a bird, and again be subject to the same radiation. So that where you have reincarnation, there's a stronger motivation to care for the environment because one never escapes it. Also, very often in indigenous philosophical systems or indigenous lifeways, indigenous religions and cultures. And you'll notice that all of those terms, philosophy, lifeway, religion, and culture, can nearly be used interchangeably. That around the world, a very common feature of religious or spiritual philosophies is what we would call shamanism, or the having of shamans. Shamans would be spirit healers, medicine men or medicine women, simply medicine people, and oftentimes spirit journeys. Spirit journeys in many cultures, especially in Native American indigenous cultures, would be often accomplished through psychoactive substances. Peyote, ayahuasca, even the traditional Native American peace pipe, all had psychoactive properties. For these cultures, psychoactive substances can be used as a way to commune with the divine. This is something that our culture now in the United States largely disallows. In Hinduism, a type of hallucinogenic mushroom called soma, S-O-M-A, was used for similar purposes. And throughout the Old World and the New World, chemicals like cannabis, what is often called marijuana, was very often used for medicinal purposes. We actually have some people in our society that would properly be considered spirit healers today. I think that the 20th century and 19th century before that, what we call televangelists, often occupy a similar role as spirit healers in indigenous societies. One famous televangelist is named Benny Hinn, H-I-N-N. Benny Hinn is famous for swinging his suit coat jacket around with the characteristic, "Be healed!" And the church members fall over backwards as if fainting. That has every single element of shamanism. It's simple faith healing. In that sense, too, Jesus would be a shaman. He uses supernatural spiritual powers to heal people and goes on at least one, if not a few, spirit journeys. 40 days in the wilderness with the temptation of the devil. That's a spirit journey. Often indigenous religions are significantly more community-oriented rather than individual-oriented. Examples would be the Hawaiian deities, including Pele, goddess of wind, lightning, and volcanoes. For the Hawaiian indigenous philosophy, spirituality, religion, culture, or life way, the very land on which they live is the sacred body of their god. For the Hawaiians, God is not separate from the world. God is one with the world. There's not a distinction between creator and creation. The creation is the creator. We'll discuss various interesting, philosophically similar ideas to this throughout the course. So, pay special attention to those as they occur, as they are especially philosophically relevant, both in the non-Western world as well as in the Western world. In the continental United States, we have the indigenous American Kokopele, a flute-playing fertility god of the Hopi Indians, as well as a various number of trickster gods. One example would be Coyote in the spiritual philosophy of the Nez Perce Indians in the U.S. Pacific Northwest. We'll come back and focus on a lovely story about Coyote in a few minutes. Before the Christianization of Europe, there would have been also an indigenous European set of cultures, religions, lifeways, or philosophies. These might often be called Druidism, and they include the Norse pantheon, which would have worship in old-growth oak groves, as well as the gods Odin or Wotan, Tyr, the war god, Thor, Freya. These would be the people who built Stonehenge. And these and other religious systems are often referred to as paganism or pagan. Notice that these indigenous Northern European deities still remain with us to this day. Tuesday is literally Tyr's Day, named for the war god Tyr. Wednesday is literally Woden's Day. That's why it's spelled so strangely. Thursday is Thor's Day. Friday is Freya's Day. So that these indigenous cultures and their religious systems still leave vestiges in our language, even now, thousands of years later. We'll also pay special attention to the Egyptian religious culture, which is especially noteworthy for the story of Osiris, who is killed and brought back to life from the dead, resurrected, and whose resurrection symbolizes agricultural fertility in the changing of seasons, a common theme that we'll investigate more soon, as well as an important culture for being one of the earliest to include the idea of the immortal soul. The immortal soul is one of the most philosophically, culturally, and historically relevant ideas we will discuss this semester. Because so much of Western philosophy is influenced by Christianity, we will need to trace the idea of the immortal soul throughout its development, from Islam and Christianity, in which it appears today, back through other cultures that have this idea around the world, in the form of reincarnation in Buddhism and Hinduism. Its curious lack, or largely lack, of that idea in Judaism, but its forerunners in Egyptian polytheism. This idea that death is not the end of lived experience, or conscious experience more accurately, is common, nearly ubiquitous. But that raises an interesting question. If there are many different cultures that have the idea of an immortal soul, does that mean it's more likely true? Or could there be different understandings or even different actualities of the transition that the soul goes through upon death? Or, somewhat frighteningly, is there even a soul at all? Or is this exclusively mythology? Unfortunately, there are more indigenous philosophies and more indigenous cultures than we could possibly hope to discuss, or that we have any reason to discuss in the context of this course. If you're curious about further indigenous African, indigenous Australian, or other indigenous islander religions, I would encourage you to take a course on cultural anthropology. Though the internet is a wonderful way to learn about the variety of belief systems and their corresponding philosophies that are known to the world's cultures and their histories.